Hey everyone, so I know we finished our discussion last time with phase 3, so this will be part 2 of unit 2, lesson 2. Um, so after you finish this up, like what we talked about in part 1 with the white man's burden, you go back to the slideshow and go over the basic information about phase 4. So phase 4 is kind of one of the key phases. It talks about basically like Victorian era imperialism and this idea of social Darwinism, which is a key idea for imperialism and kind of expansionist policy, basically since from the start of Darwin for like quite some time, or since the discoveries of Darwin in quite some time. So this is one of the key terms that I definitely emphasize when talking about imperialism, because it's a key driver, a key cause for the British, among other people, to be an empire and expand their might or their influence in the world as well. So I have Queen Victoria as like a little picture of like kind of someone who's emblematic of the era. And this is her in her dress as the Empress of India, really emphasizing that idea of a big empire. So I titled this one Social Darwinism and Securing Investments. So this one combines these two ideas of investments and social Darwinism. So this one is quite significantly different than the other phases, which focused on plantations and moral. I guess this one does have to do with some moral means, but it also focuses a little bit more on economics than the previous one, whereas the first two focused a lot on economics. My bad. So social Darwinism, I talk about how a lot of social theorists applied Darwin's theories of evolution and like survival of the fittest to humanity and the different races of humanity, which is obviously a horrible contention, but it was a pretty popular idea at the time by many people in society. So that's going to be kind of hard to explain to them or let them know that that was kind of like the belief at that time period, the prevailing belief at that time period. But this prevailing belief, which is a terrible belief, was a key driver for many people to kind of better the human race because we're the fittest and we should make other people kind of follow what we're doing. So there's a bunch of different examples you can bring in with their social Darwinism theory. But then one of the big things that was pretty unique to the British Empire, or not unique, I guess, it was just figured a lot more than social Darwinism in comparison to the other empires at the time period, was the realization of economic investments. So I talk about kind of money in politics with the Rothschilds family, who invested heavily in overseas territories and projects like the Suez Canal, for example, and how a lot of times when these investments were potentially under danger, maybe the example I use in this one is in Egypt, where the Egyptian government attempts to nationalize the Suez Canal and kind of buy out the shareholders. The Rothschilds family has a large hand in ensuring that the British Empire sends troops to put down the insurrection and ensure that the British Empire maintains informal colonial control over Egypt. So, for this one, the causes, going back to the questions, the causes for this period was obviously, it's pretty spelled out in the 2 bullet points, social Darwinism and securing economic investment. So it's both a social and economic kind of thing. And then the effects of imperialism is that the British expanded quite drastically during this time period. This was their most expansionist and aggressive period of imperialism, I would argue. This is the same period as the scramble for Africa. You could even argue in this time period that there's a bit of this competition idea of we have to compete with the other empires who are becoming more strong and mighty as well. But I focus more on that in the next slide, the phase 5. Again, these phases are kind of amorphous and like I invented them. So you can do what you want with these specific phases and you can combine some. I just thought this was the best way to divide it to have a productive discussion. But some of the effects, like I was saying, are, the Great Britain really subjugated and colonized a lot of different people. And there's a lot of violence during this time period. There's also kind of a suppression of kind of self-determination as well for governments and countries, such as when Egypt was not able to declare their independence, and they basically had to continue to have this puppet government in charge. So I would say kind of a stagnation of political change for these certain countries that want to become more democratic. How does this phase British imperialism compare to the Spanish imperialism that we looked at before? Let's see, some of the things. I mean, it's very economically driven, securing those investments for sure. And then finally, how does this phase of British imperialism compare with other phases? I think you guys kind of get the point. You guys understand this material. I don't know why I'm treating you like my class. So I just think this could kind of summarize some of the causes and effects, and you guys can definitely do the rest yourself. And then the video I have with this one is a video from Four Feathers. It's just a movie. I guess it's not that popular anymore because most of our students were probably born after this time period now. But I talk about why were the British successful in Phase 4 and what might make the strategy employed in Phase 4 British imperialism problematic as time goes on. A big element of this phase was basically imperialism by gunpoint as opposed to conversion and like the moral kind of phase where they're trying to convert societies. A lot of times they force societies to do what they wanted, such as Egypt in the rebellion. They force them to do what they want through military might. So that's obviously pretty problematic. That's something we get into. And then phase 5, the last phase, there's like pseudo phase 6, but there's phase 5. There's 5 phases of imperialism for the British, and then the last phase is more about kind of what happened and how did the empire end. Because I kind of told this whole story, so you should at least kind of get to figure out what happened and when the British Empire stopped being an empire. So this is the one where I talk more about empire for the sake of competing with other empires. So the scramble of Africa and imperial endeavors done under the name of national security to secure certain locations, such as the Suez Canal. That's very important to connect them to their British colony or their Indian colony. But then also certain things as like the Great Game that you can even talk about between Russia and Great Britain's trying to secure in the Stan regions of Central Asia. But then also there is a bit of a morality element. And I use Winston Churchill's speech, "We shall fight on the beaches," when he's talking about kind of rallying the people for war against Germany. Because he frames it in a moral sense, which is kind of strange because you're like an empire, which is kind of known as not very moral, or like that's at least kind of it's the connotation most people associate with empire. But you see Winston Churchill kind of argue that the British Empire is the much better alternative, and he goes a little bit even further, saying it's a net positive. But he says it's a much better alternative to Nazi rule and other stuff like that. And you can talk about like the other empires at the time, who had much worse moral reasonings for expanding their empire. And I do think that it's a bit of a justification, but a lot of British people were like, it's actually okay that we're expanding our empire because we actually offer way more good things to the people that would have gotten taken over by the German Empire, Nazi Germany, the Japanese Empire. These people are treated way worse under these people than us, so we should be the ones taking them under our wing and protecting them. A very kind of paternalistic kind of relationship develops in this time period between potential colonies of the British Empire versus these other colonies that could have been under like Japanese, German Empire and Nazi rule, or even Russian and Soviet rule as well. So that's kind of like a spoiler alert. The unique question is, what was the most morally sound phase of the British imperialism, and what was the least morally sound? And they watched the "We Shall Fight on the Beaches" speech. You can watch the real one, but I feel like kids, unfortunately, they get more into like the cinematic thing. So I have the clip from The Darkest Hour, which is a lot more played up and whatnot than in reality. So that kind of lets them kind of talk about kind of the benefits and the negative impacts of imperialism. So they kind of have to sort out and weigh and evaluate imperialism in the various phases of British imperialism as a whole. So yeah, and then obviously they answer the 4 questions. So causes of imperialism for that phase would have been kind of national security interests, empire for the sake of empire, or empire for the sake of competing with other empires. What were the effects of imperialism in this phase? It was very aggressive, like the previous phase, where a lot of people were subjugated under British rule. You can look at the post World War I treaties, where Great Britain took vast swaths of land under their control, specifically in the Middle East. How did this phase of British imperialism compare with Spanish imperialism? Oh yeah, I'm not going to do that because you guys are smart. You guys are smarter than my kid is. And then finally, the last one, I just kind of talk about the dissolution of the largest empire in history. I have a little picture of the British Empire at its height in 1921, where it had like all its holdings or its territories from the post-World War I treaties. And I compare it to Great Britain now, where you just kind of see it right there with its like little islands it still maintains. So I talked about like, well, if this empire was like around for so long, kind of what happened. This one isn't as big as cause and effect. Again, I'm just kind of giving them a conclusion to the story. So I talk about the war debts that they incurred from World War I and World War II, and then also a new bipolar world order with the US and the USR kind of running things, and kind of those are the people that you want. All countries who are like not powerful in the world want to be on one or the other side for security reasons, and no one wants to be with Great Britain because they can't defend them against these mighty empires of the Cold War. And then also independence movements as well. I talk about people being unwilling, or I talk about people just wanting to break away from the empire because the empire doesn't have the same prestige as it used to have. I saw like some quotes that you can bring up with certain people in Singapore talking how highly they thought of the British people and how happy they were to be British citizens. But then after the Japanese seizure of Singapore, they realized that the British Empire wasn't as powerful or as mighty and as good of a protector as they thought they could be. And the same goes for other places like Australia and stuff. So that's kind of how I conclude the story of British imperialism. So you don't have to ask any questions for that phase. But I do have, well, okay, you don't have to ask the generic questions, but the unique question is, how did the British Empire fail to fit in with the New World Order after World War II? And then I also asked the question, what could be the role of the UK in today's geopolitical landscape? The reason why I have this extra question is like my sophomores actually have a pretty good interest in kind of like modern day affairs. I wouldn't say they have a great knowledge in modern day affairs, but they have kind of a large willingness to talk about these things with me. So I will actually talk about that, but sometimes like on Tuesday, I had like a kind of thought-provoking like modern day question, like no one cared. And I was like, oh, we can just move on because it's not super essential to the unit. It's just kind of a relationship building, kind of build on their interest and their passions kind of question, as opposed to something directly related to the content, which of course is super important, but it also means you can't skip it if your class just isn't interested. And then for the downfall of the British Empire, the kind of accompanying videos I have are the Suez Crisis. I've actually made Edpuzzle videos, so I'll eventually embed them in instead of just the generic YouTube videos that I have right now. So we kind of look at the Suez Crisis of I think it was the 50s, and how the Suez Crisis kind of exposed the weaknesses of these old world empires like France and Great Britain, how they wouldn't be able to compete. And they're basically like kind of a form of diplomacy that was from a different age that wasn't able to fit in the age of superpowers with Great Britain, or my bad, the USSR and the USA. So yeah, let me know what you think about this lesson. Thanks for your time. Again, I'm open to feedback and criticism. I actually really like that because I'm a first-year teacher, so I know what I'm doing is not perfect or close to it. And I hope I could have helped you with some sort of ideas of how to do it, or you can just like use some of the resources I have. So thanks for your time. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a good one.